So what is collective impact, and how does it help us align the partners that we're working with in communities around a project play agenda? Part of where the question came to this is when we're looking at how folks tend to kind of tackle those social problems in communities, sometimes it's sort of like very straightforward. It's baking a cake. Like we're gonna create, get a medicine that is like targeted straight to a very specific kind of challenge. We're gonna have a immunization that it's going to be able to tackle an illness, and that's going to be the way to be able to take it. Sometimes it's more complex, like sending a rocket to the moon. It's something that it has very complicated complicated features that we're going to do, but if we do it over and over again, we're going to get a better result over time. But there are some things that are actually more complicated than rocket science, and things like raising a child are really complex. If you've raised more than one child, it's not the same the second time through. Things change over time. But the challenge is often with social problems, we tend to come up with solutions that are a little bit more like baking a cake or sending a rocket to the moon, while when you're really trying to do this work, it is complex. It's really variable. One community and the other community are not the same, and your community changes over time. So how do you actually kind of respond in really complex environments to changing times, and have a way to kind of see, learn, and do together as community partners? And that's really what the whole collective impact piece is getting into. It's sort of how do you bring all of those solutions to bear on what you're trying to do. So that's what the kind of approach is. The challenge is we tend to sort of take a kind of a single issue approach, especially in this country, where you kind of sort of see a challenge, and this is actually some mapping that was done in a community. This is Los Angeles County, where they kind of looked at you find an issue, you create a funding stream. Sometimes you create a task force around that funding stream, and this is, so at the top it's like education, health and food, social services, child and family, mental health probation, and kind of the typical family, and you create each kind of thing that you think that they're trying to address. Maybe it's food and nutrition, maybe it's obesity, maybe it's education, and you're trying to get the funding to them, and it starts to look like this massive bowl of spaghetti. How is that family going to navigate this? Are people working with that family going to be able to navigate that? That's sort of how we do things typically. Is there a different way? We also, with our community partnerships, kind of do the same thing. This is a county, upstate New York, mostly rural community, just trying to map their coalitions and networks. And we'll make this all available for you. So I see the pictures kind of going, but we will have the slides available so that you can use them. We have a lot of these resources online, but people are really trying to make sense out of this, because people have that idea of it takes a village, but we recreate that village over and over again around each issue. And and then you end up having this kind of inefficiency of partnerships and fragmentation around partnerships, because everybody knows, well, I need to get the schools, I need to get my business community, I need to get that. It's like, how do you do that, right? Is there a more efficient way to do our partnership work? Because we often kind of, we're tackling the same challenges in the same community, but often around different single issue pieces, right? So the collective impact kind of work sort of in some ways rose out of how do we do the partnership work more effectively. And in the children and youth space, a lot of the work that we do at the forum is how do you do that actually in a whole child way, in a big picture way, where you're actually looking at, well, what are those outcomes that you actually want for our children and youth, and who are the other partners in the community that are working on that? The Aspen Community Foundation, when they were working on this with their kind of cradle to career effort, started talking about how they sort of felt like they had individual acts of kind of random acts of partnership, and they also talked about it sort of random acts of kindness. But it was a lot of partnerships that were going on. And they're thinking, well, how can we actually take that isolated impact and think about it in a more collective impact way? That you really are bringing together that commitment of key actors in your community that are really working towards those population level outcomes, really looking at it in terms of scale and looking at it in that kind of cross-sector way in terms of partnership. How are you getting all of those kind of variable efforts working in the same direction? Oversimplified, picture in a way, yes, but where you're actually seeing people get some traction, they're at least aiming in the same direction. How do we start doing that? That is that kind of common agenda piece that we want to spend some time where we're going to be starting our work today. Another way of looking at that, and this is if you look in your workbook, I think it's just right inside the front cover, where we say if the collective impact is how do you actually say what are the outcomes that you're looking at, those population level outcomes. You start with the end in mind. What's the change that you want to see? How do you get a sense of your own community context? So if the change that we want to see for children and youth, we really want to not have individual young people beat the odds, but we want to change the odds for all children and youth in our community. How do we actually then change the fabric of families, school, community supports? Are there enough opportunities for play? Are there enough activities and whether it's the sports activities or whether it's paths? There's one community I'm working with that's just looking at how to change the policies around the trails. It's a rural community, but the trails that are in their community and the transportation options so that there's more ways to get around that are not dependent on gas-powered vehicles. So how do you think about the community context? And then really, how are we working together as leaders to turn that picture? And how are you making those gears kind of connect tighter and tighter? So that's the conversation that as we work through the work today, we're actually going to be kind of working through this picture a little bit as well. What are we trying to change? What are those underlying conditions? And who are we working with? By the end of the day, who are the partners that actually care about that picture as well, that we can be working through that conversation? Does it make a difference? I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the partnerships that we were looking at and that our friends at the Collective Impact Forum were looking at were those that we were actually seeing a change in terms of the outcomes. The community I've been working with in the last few years on an initiative that sort of springboards off of this has been in Tacoma, Washington, where they really were sort of listed as one of those dropout factories. And they came together as a community, and the school district was at the lead with it, was like, we've got to be in the work as well, but also their Graduate Tacoma initiative, looking at how can we turn the curve in terms of this, and really has been changing for all of the groups. It's been varying within the kind of racial and ethnic groups, but really turning the dial in terms of their graduation rates and going from the 55% back in 2010 up to 80%, 82% more recently. The key conditions, what we're going to be working through in terms of our agenda today. And if you flip to your workbook on page 3, I think, these were the things that when you looked at those partnerships, these were the key elements in mind. And we're going to take time on each of these as we go through today, so I'm not going to go through them in huge detail now because we're going to be taking in each of our sessions time to really unpack these. But the common agenda is not just the goals, it's the whole kit and caboodle. It's what are the goals and how are we going to get there? Do we have a shared vision and a game plan? The shared measurement, do we have an idea of how we're going to measure and know if we're making a difference? And we're going to be accountable for it. The mutually reinforcing activities is not are we all doing the same thing, but it's those arrows moving in the same direction. Do we have a way to communicate in our group, those who are working on it, and the idea that it's an ever-expanding group and we're engaging with community members and a broad set of community members and defining leaders broadly in terms of that work? And then really the magic, I think, in this and the naming of this collective impact work is identifying the fact that you do need to have somebody coordinating this and helping support that action to happen. And you need to have that funding for those local coordinators to really be able to help not do the work itself, but be able to help that work move forward. There are a lot of kinds of partnerships. You could take that list of 5 and say that characterizes a lot of different partnerships, not just those by collective impact that are cross-sector. In your community work, you probably have partnerships that are a couple of organizations coming together, some that are more like provider networks, that they're in the same kind of field and they're supporting each other's work and they're doing referrals. and some that really are these kind of cross-sector groups that are working to do move outcomes for an entire population group. So I might be getting together to just move for the ones I'm serving already, or expanding who I serve, but I might be also trying to say for all the young people in my community. But some of those principles of partnership could be working in any of those types of partnership. So whether you're trying to go back and work on a collective impact effort that's a broad scale, or trying to work with other providers that are like you, other sports leagues, or with a school community partnership, these principles could be relevant for who you look at too and are thinking about working with partners back home. Whether it's about increasing performance, increasing reach, looking at the strategies that you're sharing, or really moving that outcome at scale, there's a lot of reasons to look at the principles that we're going to be unpacking today in terms of your work. There's lots of roles you can play, and we're going to be looking through this today to think about different kinds of working groups that you might want to be able to have, from coaching training to play spaces, lots of kind of partners that you might have at the table, from public health to sports groups to parents to tech and media. So there's a lot of kind of partners you can have, and the thing I just wanted to end with before we kind of wrap and move into your actual sessions is it may not just be a group that you're leading. You may also want to think about and look around as you start this work and say, or as you continue work that you're already doing, and say, who else cares about the agenda that I care about? Are there others in my community that really think that what Project Play is doing is critically important to their agenda? In Palm Beach County, they have a Cradle to Career initiative that's looking at everything from birth up through graduation and entering into adulthood. They identified key developmental steps along the way, key outcome measures that they wanted to have. They have a backbone group. They have 60 organizations that are community partners and key systems that are working on this. They've laid out this whole agenda, but when they started this work, almost every measure that they were looking at were the ones in red, the things they wanted to prevent, the dropouts, the substance abuse, unemployment. One of the things they worked on last year was trying to identify some of the positive things they could be about. Were there some positives that they could actually measure and say, this is what we care about? I'm not sure. I actually dropped them a note, but they're getting ready for a hurricane right now. So I'm not sure that they're going to get back. They weren't able to get back to me by this morning. Whether they have a Project Play in their community. But I know they would have loved last year to know that there was a group really organized around increasing physically active opportunities for children and youth in their community, because it wasn't a big focus. They added it as an outcome and an indicator that they wanted to measure, but it wasn't something that they already had a group organized to kind of take on and say, hey, we're doing that. We want to take on that work group. We want to be part of that table. We want to sit down with the other funders that are there and the others in the communities and be a part of those community conversations. So I encourage, as you're thinking about like who the partners could be, also think about what are the other tables in the community that you could be saying, there's another field that we can also play in to be able to move our agenda. There's some other horsepower that we can bring and some other that we can tap into. As we work through again, we're going to think through kind of how we can answer some of these questions of who at each level, where it's happening, and how well. And as we leave this, I just want you to think today, as we go through the workbook, how do these 5 conditions help us answer the questions of what are the outcomes we care about? What is the context in the community that we're trying to address? And you'll see this as we're working through. And what is it that we and our partners can actually do about that picture? So as we go through each of these kind of questions today, you're going to be kind of filling out kind of that basic storyline. What's the change that you are bringing about and want to kind of even leverage more broadly with your partners in the community, all right? And with that, I think we're moving to that common agenda conversation.
Great.
Okay? Straight ahead.
Yep.